The rain fell in sheets across the muddy camp as Commander Versha watched his soldiers drag something through the gates. He had seen many prisoners in his 40 years of service to the Kethrani Dominion, but this one was different. The creature they pulled through the mud was barely alive, and its body told a story of horror that made even Varsh feel something close to pity. It was a human. Varsh had heard of them but had never seen one in person. They were primitives from a small blue world on the edge of nowhere, and the galaxy had collectively decided to ignore them until they grew up enough to matter. But somehow, this one had ended up in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. The Veth Collective had found him. First, Versha could see the marks of their experiments covering the human skin, and one of his eyes was completely gone, while the other was swollen nearly shut. His arms bore scars of surgical cuts, and his fingers were bent at angles that suggested they had been broken and reset multiple times. The Veth were known throughout the galaxy for their cruelty, but seeing the evidence of it on living flesh was something else entirely. We found him in the wreckage of a Veth transport ship. His second-in-command reported with disgust clear in his voice. The collective was moving him to one of their research stations when our fighters hit the convoy. Versha nodded slowly as he studied the broken creature before him. According to every protocol, he knew he should order the human executed immediately. Unaligned species were not worth the resources needed to keep them alive, and this one was so damaged that he would probably die anyway. One quick shot, and the matter would be settled. But something made Versha hesitate. Perhaps it was what his scouts had told him about the raid. They said that when they breached the transport ship, they found this human shielding a young Kethrani child with his own body. The child was the daughter of one of Versha's junior officers, and she had been captured 3 weeks earlier during a Veth attack on a civilian transport. She was alive because this human had protected her even though he had no reason to do so. Even though he was a prisoner himself with nothing to gain. Take him to the medical bay. Versha heard himself say. His second-in-command stared at him like he had grown a second head. "Sir?" "You heard me," Versha replied in a tone that allowed no argument. "Stabilize him and put him in a holding cell when he is strong enough to survive it." "Commander, this is a waste of resources." His second protested. "We are in the middle of a war, and our medical supplies are already stretched thin." Versha turned to face his officer directly, and his golden eyes were hard as stone. "That creature saved Tella's life," he said quietly. "What does it say about us if we let him die in the mud like an animal?" The second-in-command had no answer for that. The human was carried to the medical bay, and the camp medics worked through the night to keep him breathing. His name was Marcus. They learned this 3 days later when he finally woke up and spoke his first words. He was a freighter pilot who had been hauling cargo through what he thought was empty space when the Veth intercepted his ship. His crew of 4 had been taken as well, but Marcus was the only one still alive. The others had died on the Veth operating tables one by one. Versha found himself visiting the human cell in the days that followed. He told himself it was to assess the prisoners' potential value, but that was a lie, and he knew it. There was something about Marcus Cole that drew him in. The human did things that made no sense to a Kethrani mind. He thanked the guards who brought him food even though they treated him with contempt. He learned their names and asked about their lives, and listened to their answers with what seemed like genuine interest. When one young guard mentioned that his mother was ill back home, Marcus spent an hour teaching him a breathing technique that he said might help with her pain. The guard reported this to Versha with confusion in his voice. "Why would he help me?" The young soldier asked. "I am his jailer." Versha had no answer. 2 weeks after Marcus arrived in the camp, something happened that would change everything. Lieutenant Kethra's daughter Myra fell sick with a fever that burned so hot her scales began to crack. The camp medics tried everything they knew, but nothing worked, and the child grew weaker by the hour. Kethra was one of Versha's best officers, and watching him pace outside the medical bay with terror in his eyes was painful. Then Marcus Cole sent a message through his guards. He said he might be able to help. Vershid refused, but desperation makes people do strange things. He had Marcus brought to the medical bay under heavy guard, and watched as the human examined the dying child with his one remaining eye. "I've seen this before," Marcus said quietly. "On my world we call it heat sickness, and it happens when the body cannot cool itself properly." He asked for cold water and cloth and something to bring down inflammation. The medics provided what he requested and watched with skepticism as Marcus worked. He wrapped the child in wet cloths and placed cold compresses on her neck and wrists, and spoke to her in a soft voice that seemed to calm her. Thrashing. Within an hour the fever began to break. By morning Myra was sitting up and asking for food. Kethra wept openly as he held his daughter, and his eyes found Marcus across the room. "Why?" he asked the human. "Why would you help us after everything that has happened to you?" Marcus Cole looked at the Kethrani officer for a long moment, and something passed across his scarred face that Versh could not quite identify. "Because she is a child," Marcus said simply, "and because someone here showed me kindness when they did not have to." He looked at Versh then, and the commander felt the weight of that single eye upon him. "I do not know why you saved my life, Commander, but I know what it cost you to make that choice, and I know what it means." Word spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. The human had saved the lieutenant's daughter. The human who had been tortured by their enemies and had every reason to hate them had chosen to help instead. Something shifted in the soldiers' attitudes after that. They still did not trust Marcus completely, but they no longer looked at him with disgust. Some even began to nod at him when they passed his cell. Vorsh watched all of this unfold and wondered what he had set in motion. He did not know it yet, but that single decision to spare a broken human's life would one day reshape the entire galaxy. The first stone had been thrown into still water, and the ripples were only beginning to spread. 6 months had passed since the night Marcus Cole saved. Myra's life and the camp had changed in ways that Varsh could never have predicted. The human was no longer kept in a cell. Varsh had filed paperwork declaring Marcus a tactical asset under his personal command, which was a legal trick that kept High Command from demanding the prisoner be transferred to a research facility for study. It was a risky move that had earned Varsh more than a few enemies among the admirals. But he did not care. Kethrani culture was built on one principle above all others, and that principle was simple. Debts must be paid. Varsh owed Marcus for saving Tella during the raid on the Veth transport. Lieutenant Kethra owed Marcus for saving his daughter from the fever. A dozen other soldiers owed the human for small kindnesses he had shown them during his time in the camp. And Marcus Cole had never asked for anything in return. This troubled Versh more than he could express in his experience. Every creature wanted something: power, or wealth, or safety, or revenge. But Marcus seemed content to simply exist among them and help where he could and ask for nothing. It made no sense. The human had begun working in the camp's maintenance bay 3 months earlier when he noticed that one of the water filtration units was failing. He had asked the chief engineer if he could take a look at it, and within 2 hours, he had not only fixed the problem, but improved the system's efficiency by nearly 30%. Word of this spread quickly, and soon Marcus was being called upon to fix all manner of broken equipment. His hands were still damaged from the Veth torture, and some of his fingers did not bend properly, but he worked around these limitations with a patience that amazed the Kethrani technicians. "How do you know so much about machines?" one young engineer asked him. Marcus smiled his strange human smile and shrugged. "I spent 20 years keeping old freighters flying on spit and hope," he said. "When you cannot afford new parts, you learn to make do with what you have." The war continued to go badly for the Dominion. The Veth Collective pushed deeper into Kethrani territory with each passing month, and the casualty reports grew longer and longer. Varsh unit was stationed on a world called Kethra Minor, which was close enough to the front lines that they could hear the distant thunder of Orbital bombardments on some nights. Morale across the Dominion's military was collapsing. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers, and those who remained fought with the grim acceptance of creatures who expected to die. But not in Varsh's unit. His soldiers fought harder than any in the sector, and they held positions that other units abandoned, and they won battles that should have been impossible. The admirals noticed this and sent inspectors to discover the secret of Varsh's success. They expected to find some new weapon or tactic. What they found instead was a one-eyed human sitting by a fire and telling stories to a group of young soldiers. Marcus had become the heart of the unit in ways that Varsh still did not fully understand. He listened when the soldiers needed to talk about their fears, and he made them laugh with tales of his homeworld, and he remembered every name and every face and every small detail that others forgot. When a young private received news that his brother had been killed in battle, Marcus sat with him through the night and said nothing at all. He simply stayed so that the boy would not have to grieve alone. When a veteran sergeant confessed that she was terrified of the coming battle, Marcus helped her write letters to her, children letters that would be sent if she did not survive. He did not tell her that everything would be fine because they both knew that might be a lie. Instead, he helped her prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The soldiers began to call him Brother Marcus, though he was not Kethrani and could never truly be one of them. They protected him fiercely, and any enemy who came near him would have to go through them first. Varsh watched all of this with growing wonder. He had commanded soldiers for 4 decades, and he had never seen anything like this. "What are you?" he asked Marcus one night as they sat together watching the stars. The human considered the question for a long moment. "I am just a man," he said finally. A very tired man who has seen too much darkness and decided that he would rather light candles than curse the night. Varsh did not fully understand this human expression, but he thought he grasped the meaning. The darkness is winning. He said quietly, "The collective grows stronger every day, and we grow weaker, and I do not know how much longer we can hold." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know. Does that not frighten you?" The human turned to look at Varsh with his single eye, and there was something in his expression that the commander could not read. "Commander, I've been afraid every day since the Veth took me," Marcus said. "But fear is not the enemy, and giving up is the enemy, and becoming like them is the enemy." He gestured at the camp around them where soldiers were laughing and talking and living despite the war that surrounded them. "You saved my life when you had no reason to do so," Marcus continued. "And in doing so, you showed me that there is still good in this galaxy, and that the Veth have not won yet, and that maybe they never will." Varsh felt something tighten in his chest. "I saved one broken human," he said. "That will not win us the war." Marcus smiled, and there was something knowing in that smile, something that made Varsh feel like he was missing a crucial piece of information. "You would be surprised, Commander," the human said. "Sometimes the smallest stones create the biggest ripples." Varsh did not understand what Marcus meant, but he would. In the months that followed, the legend of Varsh's unit spread across the Dominion. Other commanders began to request transfers to his command, and soldiers who had lost hope found it again in the presence of the strange human who had no reason to care, but cared anyway. The debt that Varsh owed Marcus Cole grew larger with each passing day, and somewhere out in the darkness of space, something was watching. Something was waiting, and something was making a decision that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. 2 years had passed since Varsh first ordered his medics to save the dying human. In that time, Marcus Cole had become something more than a prisoner or an asset or even a friend. He had become family. Varsh sat across from the human in his private quarters, sharing a bottle of something strong that the supply officers had somehow acquired. Outside, the war raged on, and the news grew worse with each passing week. The Veth Collective had taken another 3 systems, and the Dominion's fleet was stretched so thin that defeat seemed inevitable. But tonight Versh did not want to think about the war. Tonight he wanted to understand the mystery that had lived in his camp for 2 years. "Tell me about your people," he said to Marcus. "Not the official reports, but the truth." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and his single eye stared into the amber liquid in his glass. "What do you think you know about humanity?" he asked finally. Versh shrugged. "You are primitives from a small world in an unremarkable system, and you have not yet developed faster than light travel, and the galactic community decided to leave you alone until you matured enough to join civilization." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That is what we wanted everyone to believe." Versh felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The human set down his glass and looked directly at Versh. "We cracked faster than light travel 60 years ago, Commander. And we have been out here ever since." The words did not make sense. Versh's mind rejected them as impossible. "That cannot be true," he said. "We would have detected your ships and your communications and your presence. Would you?" Marcus asked. "Humans are very good at hiding when we want to be, and we wanted to be invisible more than anything." "Why?" Marcus stood and walked to the window where distant stars burned cold and bright. "Because we watched what happens to young species that announce themselves," he said quietly. "We intercepted your communications and studied your history and learned everything we could about the powers that rule this galaxy." He turned back to face Vershus. "We watched the Pelori get absorbed into the Dominion and lose everything that made them unique, and we watched the 10 get exterminated by the Collective because they had resources the Veth wanted, and we watched a dozen other species get crushed between the great powers like insects between stones." Versh wanted to protest, but the words died in his throat. Everything Marcus said was true. "We decided to wait." Marcus continued. "We built our ships in secret and developed our weapons in hidden facilities and trained our soldiers where no one would ever find them, and we watched and we learned and we waited for something to change." "Waited for what?" Marcus smiled sadly. "For a reason to pick a side." The pieces began to fall into place in Versh's mind. "The Veth gave you a reason when they captured you. They gave us anger." Marcus agreed. "They tortured my crew and killed them one by one and did things to me that I will never fully recover from, and yes, that made us angry." He stepped closer to Versh. "But anger is not enough to build an alliance on, and hatred fades. With time and revenge is a poor foundation for anything lasting." "Then what?" Marcus placed his hand on Versh's shoulder. "You gave us a reason. Commander and your soldiers gave us a reason, and this camp gave us a reason." Versh did not understand. "I saved one human, and my soldiers learned to tolerate him, and that is all." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You showed mercy when you had no obligation to. And your soldiers opened their hearts to someone who was different and strange, and you proved that not everyone in this galaxy is a monster." He squeezed Versh's shoulder. "My people have been watching this camp for 2 years, and they have seen everything, and they have made a decision." Before Versh could respond, his communicator lit up with an emergency signal from Dominion High Command. He answered it with shaking hands. The face that appeared on the screen was Admiral Kethshan herself, and she looked like someone who had just witnessed the impossible. "Commander Vershus," she said, and her voice trembled. "Something is happening, and we do not understand it." "What is it, Admiral?" "Ships," she said. "Thousands of ships have just appeared at the edge of collective space, and they are broadcasting a message on all frequencies." "What kind of ships?" The Admiral's eyes were wide with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. "They call themselves the Human Defense Force, and they say they are here to honor a debt." Versh turned slowly to look at Marcus. The human was smiling. "How many ships?" Versh asked without looking away from Marcus. 17,000. "Commander, and they are moving toward the collective home systems." The communicator fell from Versh's numb fingers. You planned this." He whispered, "No." Marcus said, "I was just a freighter pilot in the wrong place at the wrong time, and everything that happened after that was a surprise to me too. But your people knew, and they were watching. Yes, and they saw what you did. For me, and they saw what kind of people the Kethrani really are, and they decided that you were worth fighting beside." Marcus picked up the communicator and handed it back to Varshi. "My people could have stayed hidden forever, and we could have let the Dominion fall and waited for the collective to weaken before revealing ourselves, but that is not who we are. Who are you then?" Marcus Cole looked at the Kethrani commander who had saved his life 2 years ago for no reason at all. "We are humans," he said, "and we pay our debts." The galaxy was about to learn what that meant. The Veth Collective had dominated the galaxy for 300 years. Their fleet numbered in the tens of thousands, and their technology was centuries ahead of most species, and their reputation for cruelty kept entire civilizations in line through fear alone. No one had ever seriously challenged their supremacy. No one had ever dared until now. Admiral Vethkan stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human fleet approach with something he had never felt before in his long career. Uncertainty. The ships emerging from faster-than-light travel were unlike anything in his databases. They were sleek and dark, and moved with a precision that spoke of technology far beyond what primitives should possess, and there were so many of them. How is this possible? His first officer whispered. They were supposed to be primitives, and they were supposed to be generations away from space travel. Vethkan had no answer. The human fleet broadcast a message on all frequencies, and the voice that spoke was calm and cold. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Human Defense Force, and we are here for the Veth Collective. And you have taken our people and tortured them and killed them, and we have come to remind you that actions have consequences." The message repeated in every language known to the galaxy, to the Kethrani Dominion and all other species. Currently at war with the Collective, we offer alliance and friendship, and to the Veth, we offer one chance to surrender. Admiral. Vethkan laughed at this. Surrender to primitives was unthinkable. He ordered his fleet to attack. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for centuries to come, not because it was close, but because it was not human weapons. Tore through Veth shields like they were made of paper, and human ships moved with a speed and agility that Veth targeting systems could not track, and human tactics exploited weaknesses that they, Collective, did not even know they had. The Veth had grown complacent in their dominance. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who was truly dangerous. Humanity had spent 60 years watching and learning and preparing for exactly this moment. They knew every Veth ship design and every Veth formation and every Veth weakness, and they exploited them all in 3 hours. Admiral Vethkan's fleet was reduced to burning wreckage. His flagship was boarded by human marines, who moved through the corridors like ghosts and killed with terrifying efficiency. Vethkan died with a human blade in his chest, and his last sight was a soldier whose eyes held no mercy. Word of the battle spread across the galaxy at the speed of light. The mighty Veth fleet had been annihilated, and the humans were not stopping. They pushed deeper into collective territory with each passing day, and the Veth forces that tried to stop them were crushed without exception. But it was not just the military victories that shocked the galaxy. It was the broadcasts. Humanity released everything they had gathered during their 60 years of watching. Every record of Veth atrocities, and every experiment they had conducted on captured prisoners, and every horror they had inflicted on weaker species. The galaxy saw what the Collective had done to human captives. They saw the bodies of Marcus Cole's crewmates dissected on surgical tables. They saw children taken from their families and subjected to tests that no civilized species would permit. They saw the true face of the Veth Collective, and it was monstrous beyond imagination. Commander Varsh watched the broadcasts from his camp on Kethra. Minor Marcus stood beside him in silence. Your people could have destroyed us too. Vorsh said, "You had the power to sweep through the galaxy and take whatever you wanted, and no one could have stopped you." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "Then why ally with us and why fight beside us instead of simply conquering everything?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Because that is not who we want to be," he said finally. "We saw what the Veth became when they let power corrupt them, and we saw the darkness that lives in the hearts of those who believe might makes right. And we decided that we would be different. But how can you trust us, and how? Do you know the Dominion will not betray you?" Marcus turned to look at Vorish. "I know because I lived among you for 2 years, and I know because your soldiers showed me kindness when they had no reason to, and I know because you saved my life when it would have been easier to let me die." He gestured at the sky where human ships patrolled alongside Kethrani vessels. "We did not pick the winning side, Commander, and we picked the right one. The war lasted 11 days. 11 days to destroy an empire that had stood for 3 centuries. The Veth homeworld fell on the 8th day, and their government collapsed on the 10th, and their remaining forces surrendered on the 11th. But humanity did not occupy their territory or enslave their population or take revenge in the ways that everyone expected. Instead, they offered terms that were harsh but fair. The Veth would pay reparations and release all prisoners and submit to monitoring to ensure they never committed such atrocities again, but they would be allowed to survive. Why? The Veth ambassador asked during the surrender negotiations, "Why spare us after everything we have done?" Admiral Sarachan looked at the alien with eyes that held pain and anger and something else that the Veth did not recognize. "Because we are better than you," she said simply. "Because we will not let your cruelty turn us into monsters, and because the galaxy needs to see that there is another way." The Veth ambassador did not understand, but in time he would. The tide had turned and nothing would ever be the same again. 1 year had passed since the fall of the Veth Collective. The galaxy was still adjusting to the new reality, and some species celebrated, while others watched with nervous eyes and wondered what would come next. Humanity had the power to rule everything. They had proven that beyond any doubt. Their fleets patrolled former collective space, and their technology was decades ahead of anyone else. And their soldiers had shown that they could crush any opposition. The surviving civilizations held their breath and waited for the humans to reveal their true intentions. Surely, they would demand tribute or territory or submission. Surely, they would become the new tyrants replacing the old ones. That was how the galaxy worked. That was how it had always worked, but humanity did something that no one expected. They asked to join the Galactic Council as equals, not as rulers or conquerors or masters, but as partners in building something better. Admiral Versh stood in the great chamber on the neutral world of Kathos Prime and watched as the treaty was signed. He was an admiral, now promoted 3 times in the past year, for his role in building the alliance between the Dominion and humanity. Marcus Cole stood beside him wearing the formal robes of Earth's first ambassador to the Kethrani people. It was a role that no one else could have filled. "This feels like a dream," Vorsh said quietly. "1 year ago, we were losing the war, and I was certain that we would all die, and now everything has changed." Marcus smiled. "Change is the only constant in the universe, Commander, and sometimes it happens faster than anyone expects." "Admiral Mao," Vorsh corrected him. "You keep forgetting old habits, and I will always remember you as the commander who saved my life in the mud." The delegations filed out of the chamber, and the treaty was official, and the galaxy had a new order. An order built not on fear or domination, but on something that had never been tried before: cooperation. The terms were simple. Every species would be treated with dignity, and no one would be conquered or absorbed or exterminated, and disputes would be settled through negotiation rather than war, and kindness would be remembered. The last clause had been humanity's only demand. It seemed small and almost childish to the veteran diplomats who negotiated the treaty, but Marcus understood its importance. "Tell me something," Varsha said as they walked through the gardens outside the chamber. "When you first arrived in my camp broken and dying, did you know that your people were watching?" "No," Marcus admitted. "I thought I was alone and I thought I would die in that cell, and I thought that everything I had ever known was gone forever. Then why did you help us, and why did you show kindness when you had every reason to hate?" Marcus stopped walking and looked up at the alien sky, because kindness was all I had left. He said, "The Veth took everything else from me, and they took my eye and my health and my crew and my future, but they could not take who I chose to be." He turned to face Vorish. "I decided in that cell that I would not let them turn me into something I was not, and I decided that I would rather die as a good man than survive as a monster. And that decision changed everything." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Your decision changed everything, and you chose to save me when the rules said you should let me die. And you chose mercy when cruelty would have been easier, and you showed me that the Kethrani were worth fighting for." Varish considered this. "I did not know any of that when I gave the order, and I did not know about your hidden fleet or your watching eyes. And I saved you because it felt like the right thing to do. That is exactly the point." Marcus said, "You did it without expecting anything in return, and you did it because of who you are, not because of what you might gain, and that is what made it mean something." They walked in silence for a while. Around them delegates from 100 worlds discussed trade agreements and border arrangements and all the mundane details of building a new civilization. None of them fully understood what had brought them to this moment. The Veth believed that cruelty was strength. Vorsh said finally, "They built their entire civilization on the idea that mercy was weakness and that only the ruthless deserved to survive." "Yes, they were wrong," Marcus nodded. "They were wrong, and they fell because of it, and their empire that stood for 3 centuries was destroyed in 11 days by a species they dismissed as primitives. Because you were strong? Because we were kind," Marcus corrected. "Because we found allies who were worth fighting beside, and because one Kethrani commander showed a broken human that not everyone in the galaxy was a monster." Vershil looked at his friend. "You give me too much credit, and I made one small decision on one rainy night, and that is all. Small decisions have big consequences." Marcus said, "A single spark can light a fire that changes the world, and a single act of kindness can turn the tide of a galactic war." The sun was setting over Kithos Prime, and the sky turned colors that neither human nor Kethrani had words for. "What happens now?" Versh asked. "Now we build something better." Marcus said, "We show the galaxy that there is another way, and we prove that cooperation is stronger than domination, and we make sure that no species ever has to face what the Veth did to my people. And if we fail, then we fail trying to be good rather than succeeding at being evil, and that is worth something." Versh thought about the young commander he had been 2 years ago. He thought about the broken human in the mud, and the choice he had made and everything that had followed. He thought about the soldiers who had learned to call Marcus brother, and the children who had been saved, and the hope that had been rekindled in hearts that had given up. It started with one act of kindness. He said, "Yes," Marcus agreed. "And it will continue with 1,000,000 more, and each one will ripple outward and touch lives we will never know and change the future in ways we cannot imagine." The stars came out one by one as darkness fell, but it was not the empty darkness of before. It was a darkness filled with promise and possibility, and the light of countless worlds united for the first time in history. The galaxy had learned something that it would never forget, that the smallest choices still mattered, that mercy was not weakness, that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe, and that sometimes the species everyone underestimated was the one that changed everything. The war was over. The new galaxy was just beginning. And it all started with one act of kindness to a human in the end.